Hi there YouTube, it's that one guy in lit class. Today I'd like to talk about Aristotle's Poetics, which is actually more about what we now think of as drama than it is about what we think of as poetry. So anyway, Aristotle was big on classifying things, and the Poetics is no exception to this trend. He starts off by defining what poetry is. His general definition is that poetry is anything written in verse form. He then goes on to talk about the kinds of poetry, and gives examples of two kinds: narration, which is like the Iliad in which a narrator tells the story, and the poetry of representation. In Greek, the word representation is mimesis, and we've talked about mimesis in the past in a video about Homer and Auerbach, and if you need a more in-depth refresher, it may be worth going back to that video. But for the sake of clarity, let's restate that mimesis is the act of representing something. Aristotle argues that this representation has three subcategories that make it up: media, which is like painting versus writing versus speaking; objects, which is like the main focus of the work, also known as the characters in it; and manner, which is how the work is told. Is the action narrated, or is the action shown by actors on a stage? Aristotle focuses on this last example and calls the act of showing action drama, because it represents people doing, and the Greek word for that is drontos. He goes on to say that poetry as a whole is a naturally occurring thing, since representation is natural in humans from childhood, and he even argues that our ability to represent is one thing that separates us from the animals. He also argues that representation is enjoyable to everyone. He therefore argues that tragedy and comedy, and really all representation, arose out of a natural desire that people had to tell stories. And it's important here to note before we go any further that Aristotle was much more interested in tragedy than comedy, and thought it to be a higher form of art. As he puts it in the Poetics, comedy prefers to represent people who are worse than those who exist; tragedy, people who are better. After giving a bit of history about how tragedy and comedy split, as well as some of the differences between tragedy and epics, all of which I encourage you to read, but we're going to skip over here for the sake of time, though there is a link in the description, Aristotle finally gives us his definition of tragedy: a representation of a serious, complete action which has magnitude in embellished speech, with each of its elements separately in the parts, by people acting and not by narration, accomplishing by means of pity and terror the catharsis of such emotions. So that's totally clear, right? Maybe not. So let's break it down. We've already talked about representations, aka mimesis, and we've already mentioned that drama is defined by Aristotle as something which is acted rather than narrated. So those parts should hopefully be pretty straightforward. Aristotle defines embellished speech as speech which has, quote, rhythm and melody. In other words, some spoken parts and some sung parts. And, with each of its elements separately in the parts, simply means that there is a division in the play between the areas that are spoken and the areas which are sung. So all we have left to do now is define catharsis. Unfortunately, that becomes complicated and deserves a whole video to itself, where we talk about the elements of a tragedy which lead to that catharsis. And that's just what we'll do next time. Thanks for watching. Cheers.